STD. It's probably one of the most feared acronyms in the English language. Today we're going to talk about STDs and or STIs, sexually transmitted infections and diseases. So as much as the idea of STDs and STIs scares everyone and sends people running for the hills, the number one thing that you should know is that you actually probably know someone who has an STI or STD. There are over 20 million new infections in the United States per year as estimated by the CDC, and that number is incredibly conservative. That only includes 8 common infections. The World Health Organization says that there are over 30 sexually transmitted infections and diseases. So that number, that 20 million, does not include things like pubic lice, scabies, molluscum contagiosum, and a number of others. So there are quite a few additional infections, as well as that doesn't include the infections that are either undiagnosed or undetected, that are just not, people are not aware that they have because they don't have symptoms. And being asymptomatic, not having symptoms of an infection, is actually the most common symptom of all STIs and STDs. So the only way to know if you have an infection is to get tested. So to further illustrate that it's very likely you probably know someone who has had an infection or still currently has an infection, the American Sexual Health Association estimates that 80% of all sexually active people have had HPV, the human papillomavirus, at some point in time in their lives. For instance, if you've had an abnormal pap smear, for all the ladies out there, that means you have had an HPV infection. Most commonly, you're not told that it's an HPV infection because it is so common and it elicits a lot of questions and a lot of fear and a lot of trepidation that's unnecessary. The reason STIs are so common is because most people aren't aware that they can contract them via all types of sexual activity. So sexual activity is quite broad. That includes manual sex, which is things like hand jobs and fingering, and that also includes oral sex, so cunnilingus or fellatio to be fancy and to use the technical terms, and or blowjobs, getting eaten out, that kind of thing, as well as traditional vaginal penetrative sex and anal sex. With all of those activities, you can contract a sexually transmitted infection and disease. A frequent misperception is that you have to have sex with a lot of people or certain kinds of people in order to contract a sexually transmitted infection and disease, and that's just not true. Usually the reason people contract sexually transmitted infections and diseases is a result of not using comprehensive, safer sex. It doesn't mean that I'm dirty or trashy or unwanted and damaged goods. None of those things are accurate. So while you can contract an STI from manual, oral, and penetrative sex, both vaginal and anal, you cannot contract an STI from things like sharing chapsticks or sharing a glass or a soda with your friend or using a public restroom. It's one of the most commonly asked questions that I get, and it's scientifically improbable. You are not contracting an STI from a toilet seat. You can feel free to sit your butt down. You do not have to hover. Please don't hover. Oh my gosh, everybody makes such a mess in fear of a dreaded STI or STD, and really that is your least concern in a public restroom. Fun fact, I have genital herpes, HSV2, so now since watching this video you know at least one person who's had a genital herpes infection and who still has one. HSV is a long-term infection. It does not go away and it cannot be cured. It can be treated and is totally managed. The reason I talk about having an STI out loud and publicly is because really until we start talking about them, the stigma will persist. STIs are common, but they're not commonly talked about. People are afraid of them and they know very little information about them. And even though most people don't talk about it out loud or admit to having a sexually transmitted infection, the good news is I can still date. I still have a healthy sex life. I am not dirty, promiscuous, slutty, trashy, any of the things that are commonly associated with someone who has a sexually transmitted infection or disease. It doesn't define me. It has nothing to do with my character whatsoever. It's just something that I deal with medically and have to manage from time to time. And while no one wants to contract an STD, The good news is that even if you do wind up with an STI or STD, whether it's a short-term infection that's curable and or a long-term infection that's manageable, there are all sorts of resources out there to help. To recap, we talked about that STIs are very common but not commonly talked about because of the immense stigma and shame associated with contracting an STI. We decided that statistically it's highly likely that you know someone who has or has had an STI. And then we also briefly discussed that an STI is not the end of your world. So if you do end up contracting one, please see us and the resources, and I'll put a link below. This message has been brought to you by PositiveSingles.com, the #1 dating site for people who are living with an STI or STD.